I covered this in a question that I was asked on Instagram in terms of groupthink and these cognitive biases that we have. Humans, if we take an evolutionary point of view, we understand that humans operate in terms of group identity from at one level. Now, that's not, if we categorize ourselves as I am what my group espouses, and that becomes really, really bad. But we have evidence back into the 1950s where there was a really interesting study done where they got 20 Anglo-American children from middle-class families that were Protestant and put them into a camp called the Robbers Cave National Park in Oklahoma in the States. And they basically just split these kids into two groups, so about 10 or 12 years old. And then they got them to name their groups. And one of the groups were called the Rattlers. The other group was called the Eagles. They separated them, and then they did a whole bunch of activities within their own groups. And then they started to bring the groups together and started to see how they interacted. And would you believe it? Very predictable. They started to create their own identities around we're the better group. Mm-hmm. And these guys, we need to mess with these guys. And then these kids started to do things like eat the other kids' meals. If one group of kids came back later, it went so far that one group raided the other group's cabin and started overturning the mattresses and taking their stuff. They even got into fistfights, and the psychologists had to intervene around what was going on over there. What we're seeing is that established a historical theory of these group identities that we get into, even though we are the same in essence. We come from the same neighborhoods, same ages, same religious persuasions, same socioeconomic status, and yet just because we see ourselves as belonging to one group or another, we have this attack.
Wow. Well, that explains Melbourne right now. What camp are you in? What side are you on? Gee. You know, that reminds me of another experiment. I don't even know where I'm going with this, but you've just reminded me of an experiment they did with children where they put them in like a big paddock, I suppose, a big grass area, and they built a circular fence around it, and they said, you can play anywhere inside this fence, you just can't go over the fence. And that was the only instruction given to them. So what ended up happening was these children went right to the first thing they did was run right to the fence, and they were sitting on it, dangling off it, like hanging their arms through it. All they wanted to do was get as close to the boundary as possible and push that boundary. Then they did the same experiment, but they had no fence. And they said, you can play anywhere you want on this open field. And the children really didn't wander that far. They could see that it just went on and on and on and on. And so they didn't want to be too far from each other's sight. And what it made me think was, you know, and this is my personality, the more boundaries you put on people, the more laws, the more rules, the more no, you can't, the more we feel like we want to escape. Like, for example, making things mandatory, that just makes me not want to do it. But if it's voluntary and you give me education and you give me respect of making my own decision and giving me good reasons why, and then leaving it up to me, I am much more likely to take you up on whatever it is that you're asking of me, but not demanding of me, because, you know, it becomes a free choice, then you're the one who doesn't feel like there's a boundary, so you don't really want to run that far. But I found that fascinating because it was a physical example of put in a boundary, people will push it. Don't put in a boundary, and it's trusting. It was a trust thing in the children. Don't run so far that we can't see you anymore, and they didn't want to anyway. So I think that's the other big thing that I think is missing, is that the government don't trust us to make our own judgments and our own decisions, and we do feel like we're being treated like children, which is probably why so many people are acting like children. Sort of just a bit of it's a bit of chaos. absolutely.
You're onto something there, EJ. And the interesting thing, they brought up two memories for me: the Garden of Eden, where you're put into the middle of the garden and said you can do anything you want except just don't touch that tree. And the first thing they do is go around, Adam and Eve touch that tree, eat from the fruit, and kind of go from there. This is a story as old as stories have been around. If you were to understand human nature a little bit, perhaps you need to take some courses in psychology or child or human development to get into some to get into politics. Maybe that would give you a better sense of what's going on, or perhaps you should have owned a business at some point so you can understand the people that you're kind of catering towards. Or maybe you just need to read a bit of Dostoevsky to really get a sense of how psychology infiltrates within a person. I want to give a bit of hope, though, because it's really important that we have hope during this time. And I wanted to do that by circling back to the Robbers Cave experiment, because the psychologists didn't stop there. They wanted to understand what would it take for these kids to start getting along with each other again. And so what they did, they got them to pool their money together and purchase a movie that they were going to be paying. And none of them by themselves had enough money to have that movie shown. But together they had the money to show the movie. Another activity that they did was that there was a camp truck that was bogged. They fastened some ropes around the truck, and they asked all the kids to pull the truck from where it was stuck. And they had to all work together to pull that truck out. Mm-hmm. And another thing that they did, and I took only about the 3 things that they did, was the water reservoir that was feeding water into the camp broke. And so they had to work together to find a way to fix that reservoir for water to come back into the camp. And would you know it, after they worked on these, what they called superordinate goals, they started to sit together at lunchtime. They stopped calling each other names. They started to play with each other more. And they started to get along. It's a really interesting outcome there, because what we have is division, but what we don't have is these superordinate goals that will bring both camps, so to speak, together. But the superordinate goal is, let's get rid of this virus. And that's the only superordinate goal, rather than let's function collectively as a society so that we can operate.
Because the end goal is the same, which is a great thing that we have the same end goal, but we all think we're going to get there in a different way. The only strategy I have at the moment is to be the nicest person in the world without a mask on, no matter how much I'm yelled at, because it's not going to work any other way. So somebody has to be the bigger person and not get into the fight and the argument, and I'm going to try and do that and just, walk away from it or whatnot. I don't really have the energy for it anyway. But yeah, not sure. I'm not sure, because there's 2 very different camps here. And I know a lot of people not in my camp who just cannot understand the way I think, and vice versa. So I think being respectful of each other's feelings is probably the best place to start. Just being civil and listening, and the dialogue, let's not censor, let's talk. And let's keep having the conversation, because I think when the conversation stops and we're not allowed to talk anymore, that's when we're in trouble, because we can't communicate.